Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today, where we will be focusing on the hot topic of managing a hybrid workforce. I'm sure this is something which is affecting all or many businesses, and no doubt you're interested to know more. So my colleagues, who you can all see on screen, hopefully, will be discussing the various issues. We'll be starting with Danny Zona. He'll consider how best or not to operate a hybrid working model, and also highlight some of the bear traps that you may come across along the way. Emma Burrows will then look at managing sickness absence, particularly when it's COVID related. This continues to be prevalent, even though the daily stats are no longer published, as national testing stopped at the end of March. You may think that we're all over it, and that may be the case, but we perhaps shouldn't get too complacent when we hear what's happening at the moment in other parts of the world, such as Beijing. And I hear this morning in North Korea, where millions are being told to work from home due to a spike in the infection rates. Finally, Sinead Kelly will explore the sometimes murky world of employee monitoring and surveillance in relation to home working and more generally. What are the parameters of this potentially intrusive approach, particularly given individual rights of privacy? And what impact could this have on staff motivation and morale? Before we get onto these topics, I just wanted to headline a couple of related points that will no doubt be on your radar. As we all know, the cost of living crisis is hitting most of our pockets, and inflation is expected to increase to around 10% this year. As companies approach their annual pay reviews, this will inevitably raise some concerns about whether it's financially viable to keep up with the cost of inflation, especially as the Bank of England has warned about a possible recession later on in the year. I expect that most companies will conclude it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to match inflation, unless they work in the oil and gas industries or other beneficiaries of the current crisis. So it'll be interesting to see whether this has a knock-on effect to staff recruitment and retention, and whether some companies will offer greater flexibility and agility in return for more modest pay rises or even reductions. We recently posted news that law firm Stevenson Harwood has introduced a new policy whereby staff below partner level can opt to work from home permanently, but they have to give up 20% of their salary. So that's a novel idea, and it raises some questions as to fairness, but it could get some traction, so we'll have to watch the market and see what happens. No doubt pay inequality in Britain is getting even more acute, with news in the city that bonuses and pay is booming, particularly in the city financial district. We're seeing the highest rates since the financial crisis of 2008. And the IFS has said that pay and bonuses in the square mile have shot up in recent months, and we're now on average 31% higher than they were in December 2019. And at a time when the government is keen to try and reduce inflation, this is clearly not helpful. So all of this highlights the even greater importance of maintaining good employee relations as we try and navigate the choppy waters ahead. So I'll now hand over to Danny to start us off with his analysis of hybrid working. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Welcome again, everybody. Thank you for joining today. As Tanya said, I'll be looking at a hybrid, agile and flexible working with a focus on the hybrid working model. Before we get going, I'm sure we all have an idea of what flexible working is. It's not a particularly new concept. The right to request flexible working was brought in 2014 for employees with at least 26 weeks continuous service. And I'm sure some of us have seen that the government's recently proposed to make this a day one right. We've seen some businesses go in different directions. Tanya's mentioned a law firm that recently announced employees could sacrifice 20% of their salary to work from home permanently. Airbnb are letting staff work anywhere for as long as they like. Google are requiring staff to go back to the office 3 days a week, they say, to protect social capital. So there are different approaches by different industry sectors and businesses. If we could go to the next slide. And before we go into any detail into that, I've pulled what I thought would be, what thought was an interesting graph from the Office of National Statistics website, which you can see on the slide. But I thought this would give us some interesting context to some of my discussion. And as you can see, as of March 2022, while the majority of people in Great Britain were working on site only, and obviously not everyone can work from home, there were still significant numbers of people working at home, either exclusively or partially. If we could have the next slide, please. And we also thought we'd be interesting to hold a quick straw poll here to see what everyone's working pattern is as well. And a short survey should pop up in a moment asking you what your working pattern is. If you take a few seconds to vote on that. While you are doing that, we also ran this poll on LinkedIn recently, and it's still ongoing. And interestingly, we found that of the people surveyed, 22% said they were mostly office-based, 32% said they were mostly home-based, and I think around 46% said they were working on a hybrid model. So quite different statistics to the graph we just seen. Okay, so let's see what the results are now. I think everyone has had a chance to vote. So I think you should be able to see the results. 43% have said they're mostly working from home. So quite similar to our LinkedIn poll. 20% say they're working from the office. Again, very similar to what we run on LinkedIn. And 37% said they're doing a mix of both. So it seems the majority of people are working from home at some point in the week, which is, again, gives some good context to what we're discussing. If we could move to the next slide. So looking at pitfalls and difficulties, most employers have realized that there is a greater expectation for flexible working coming out of lockdown. I think most businesses, where appropriate, have by now implemented their flexible or hybrid working policies. So I won't go into too much detail about implementation, but when we've been advising on implementing and managing a hybrid policy, we have noticed some common difficulties. I've seen these being described as fault lines. I'm going to run through some of these key fault lines, but by no means these are the only ones. The first one I wanted to discuss was communication, connection, and collaboration, perhaps an obvious one. And we've all seen how an over-reliance on technology can be infuriating when it goes wrong, and how easy it can be to miscommunicate or perhaps get hold of someone virtually when you might otherwise be able to just tap them on the shoulder in the office. Most people were able to overcome this to some extent during the pandemic, purely out of sheer necessity. But with the growth of hybrid working, these fault lines can develop between people with different working patterns. It's important that employees recognise they need to create opportunities for colleagues to connect and in some cases reconnect. And this will look different in every business. But for example, it can manifest itself as encouraging phone or video calls, especially with new joiners, organising more frequent social activities, or asking staff to come in on a certain day. If you're operating a hybrid model, ensuring that everyone is in on a particular day, and saving meetings for those days that can happen in person. Remote working can also mean a loss of those small unplanned conversations that can be vital to connection and collaboration. Over time, people can get accustomed to the people they see around them, virtually and physically, and forgetting the contributions of those that are out of sight, and therefore they might miss those opportunities and those small conversations. Consulting with staff on where communication breakdowns occur in their day-to-day work is key to addressing them, as is investing in new and better communication platforms. Although, of course, some employees might not have the resources for that, and so they might want to consider better training for the platforms they currently have to unlock their potential. Some obvious solutions to problems of coordination and collaboration as well can be, to an extent, resolved by encouraging greater face-to-face interactions, whether that's physical or virtual. But employees need to decide how best to overcome their particular issues in their workplaces. But from experience, consultations with staff on what particular needs they have and what issues they're facing is a good place to start. And employers should always ensure that senior managers are leading by example when it comes to policies and practices. The next topic I want to discuss is visibility. A lack of visibility has been a common criticism of remote working, particularly by junior members who, in addition to maybe feeling less visible, can lose out on key training and learning opportunities by not simply being with senior or experienced colleagues. And remote workers risk missing out on important news, assignments, opportunities for growth, as well as I mentioned, those small and informal conversations that can be really important to connecting with key decision makers. Employers should be proactive in ensuring everyone is visible, no matter their working pattern. That's incredibly key for this. And that might involve training managers on how to deal with a hybrid team where previously they've never dealt with a hybrid team before. And providing training to and encouraging staff to speak up and to let themselves be heard in virtual meetings and emails is an effective tool, and aids in visibility as well as a tool for empowerment. And ultimately ensuring that staff who do work from home feel valued and trusted is a key way for them to feel seen and heard. A lot of these issues are interconnected as well, and encouraging staff to communicate, like I said, can help with visibility. It can, however, be tempting for managers to focus on the people they see physically in front of them, as I said. It can be quicker to assign an urgent task to the person next to you. But managers need to update sometimes their presumptions on the value that home workers add to a business. And as I'll discuss in a moment, many businesses saw an increase in the productivity of those people who worked at home. And many people actually reported working longer hours when working from home during the pandemic. So aside from that, the next point I want to discuss is discriminatory consequences for a failure to ensure that staff are visible. So any hybrid working policy introduced by an employer has the potential to have a discriminatory impact, if not properly thought through and assessed. And we've all seen, I'm sure, several reports that COVID is having sometimes a negative impact on women in the workplace. I've also seen reports that men are returning to the office in greater numbers than women after lockdown. And there was an article, I think last year, published by The Guardian that labelled this the she session, where women who accept an offer to work mostly from home risk damaging their careers as they weren't returning to the office to the same extent as men. And again, research published in April this year showed that women working from home are less likely to feel they had good career prospects compared to men. So obviously this is a complex issue, but there are things to consider here. Because prior to COVID, flexible working was generally seen as beneficial to those with care responsibilities or those with disabilities. And as you might know, it's now taken for granted by tribunals that women generally bear the greater burden of childcare responsibilities. And this was confirmed in a relatively recent EAT decision of Dobson and North Cumbria. But flexible working may now be hindering women if home workers are becoming more invisible. And also in the age of flexible working, some women might find themselves in a difficult position of being less flexible than men, despite working from home more, because they have, for example, an intricate care schedule to consider when asked to go into the office last minute or to go to that networking event. They might fear saying no, but they have these considerations to take into account and may not be able to say yes. And like I said, the situation is obviously complex, but introducing penalties or disadvantages for people working at home can have those unintended and discriminatory consequences. Employers need to bake in any additional safeguards into their hybrid working policies to ensure that no one is disadvantaged, if they choose to work from home. And importantly, employers and managers should not make assumptions as to why someone has chosen to work from home. Again, consulting with staff is often a good idea when introducing a new or controversial policy, and setting out the legitimate aims and objectives for that policy can be helpful to a later defence against discrimination, but can also make an employer seem transparent and open with its staff. And where an employee raises issues during that consultation or otherwise, they should be taken seriously. Overall, when it comes to discrimination, attention should be paid to ensuring that home working is not an obstacle to progression and opportunity. And often solutions to issues of visibility lie in solving issues of communication and connection. But no matter how rigid an employer may be with enforcing a hybrid working policy, it will always need to be mindful that they may need to deviate from that policy to provide reasonable adjustments where appropriate. That would override any policy, that duty would override any policy. The final point on this slide I want to talk about is culture. So this is intimately connected with what I've discussed already, because connection, visibility, and a sense of fairness feed into company culture. It may seem difficult to sustain a company culture when most people aren't in the office together, and it can be even more difficult to socialize new joiners when they haven't physically met anybody. It doesn't happen by default, especially within a hybrid working model, and businesses need to think about what steps they need to take to develop the culture they want. We all know that environment can shape behaviour, so ensuring the office is an attractive place to come to each week is key. This can include ensuring the physical space meets employees' needs. If businesses are moving offices, picking a good location, ensuring that there are genuine positive interactions in the offices, so encouraging meetings in person, and providing recognition and award for those who are working from home, and ensuring they also feel included. And I've also mentioned that social events are always a good way to help people bond and physically meet. When it comes to culture, I think intentionality and effort by managers and senior staff is important, and leading by example is important, because culture tends to spread top down. And you know, when managers see burnout, or they see workplace stress, or they see people not coping very well, they need to address that. Like I said, this list isn't exhaustive. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the pitfalls that we've noticed, but I think the most important ones. If we could move to the next slide, please. So now I want to go on to advantages. It's not all bad. Hybrid and flexible working can be advantageous and rewarding for many of us, and a fantastic tool for businesses. I'm going to rattle through some of the key advantages and benefits that we've noticed through our practice. And I've noticed sometimes the advantages can be two sides of the same coin, with some of the difficulties, and whether the effect is positive or negative can largely be up to the employer. So the first one is productivity, which I've already mentioned. I don't think it was any secret that many of us who worked from home during the pandemic felt they were just as, or even more productive. And recent research conducted by Microsoft found that across Europe, 82% of business leaders felt that their businesses were just as productive before the pandemic as during and after. And productivity, therefore, you know, it is key to hybrid working, and is a key benefit of it. For hybrid working to work, employers need to place trust in their employees, and you know, the majority of people who've worked from home in the last years have showed themselves to be responsible and reliable, and employees should remember the lessons they've learned through that, and shouldn't stray into re-smog style scare tactics and writing notes on people's desks that are working from home. And they certainly shouldn't take home working necessarily as you know, or presence in the office when considering promotions, bonuses, pay rises, redundancies. They can leave themselves open to an unfair and possibly discriminatory practices, complaints of, and you know, particularly if those individuals are working from home fairly well with no issues. The next topic I want to talk about is empowerment. So hybrid and flexible working, I've found when advising, can be empowering to the employees. Placing trust in staff and giving them some control and responsibility over their working life and patterns can breed job satisfaction and that sense of empowerment. This can start at the outset when hybrid policies are being drafted. So consulting staff around the decisions on working patterns can give them some ownership, but also giving people even some level of choice as to whether they work from home on a particular day or on site, or, you know, that can be empowering as well, and can definitely fit in even with a rigorous policy. All of this levels of openness and allowing involvement and control and responsibility to employees has shown to lead to increase in productivity and engagement by employees, and that has knock-on effects to connections and collaborations and creativity and you know, general sense of well-being. And having empowered employees also helps with retention rates, which is obviously an issue for every business. I won't go into this in too much detail because my colleague Emma will be dealing with this, but this week is also Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK, as some of you might know. So just briefly, feelings of empowerment and job satisfaction can also help with work-life balance and mental well-being, which was something that was of a particular focus during the lockdown. And the feelings of empowerment can also negate some of the negative aspects of working from home. So feelings of loneliness, which is actually this year's theme for Mental Health Awareness Week, These are all factors that can be taken into account and will be taken into account by your employees. So employers will do good to bear them in mind also. The next one I want to discuss is mobility. So offering flexible working or hybrid working can work to give you access to a greater talent pool outside of your physical local area, both in terms of the volume of people who might apply, but also in terms of opening the door to people who coming into the office 5 days a week might be a barrier. It can also help with retention for employees whose home or life situations might change over time. So, for example, new parents. A lot of people moved home during the pandemic or moved out of large cities. And so offering that level of flexibility might even be essential to attract the right talent who may no longer be living in your city or nearby or within a commuting distance. And often we found that candidates during interviews, one of the first questions they ask is, do you offer flexible working? So it's clearly on people's minds. Flexibility can also allow businesses to grow headcount without having to invest in larger premises. And so it can be an engine for growth without, all of the traditional costs that come with expanding. Which neatly puts me onto my next topic of cost savings. Employees can obviously make cost savings on smaller premises if they go to a hybrid flexible model. And yes, hybrid will force businesses to invest in new technology, but often where they're investing in home working equipment, laptops, for example, that can be offset by the cost saving and having to purchase less PCs for a smaller office, for example. But I think also most businesses or a large number of businesses prior to COVID were moving to a sort of hot desking, laptop kind of model. And so actually those costs might not even be there for a lot of businesses. Employers will know where they can make other cost savings for remote working, and it can help struggling businesses with temporary shortfalls, and it can even help to reduce costs and avoid redundancies. On the other side of things, recent data from the ONS showed that something around half of home workers said they've recently spent less because of home working, and these types of savings will be really valued by employees when cost of living is rising. And in this way, employees can effectively receive a pay rise in their disposable income without having a business having to actually give a pay rise at a time when they might not be able to, or might not be able to give one in line with inflation, for example. So it's, again, a key factor that employees will be taking into account, and businesses have to then also. That is me running through all of the top benefits that we've seen as a whistle-stop tour again. I think to sum up, though, the basic key to implementing a hybrid policy is to offer as much flexibility as is appropriate and suitable for the business, balanced against the business's needs. And generally, consulting staff can go a long way to developing a good policy. Thank you again for listening to my section. I'm going to hand you over now to my colleague Emma to take you through the next section.
Thanks, Danny. So following on from Danny's section, I think it's pretty clear that hybrid working is here to stay, and that certainly seems to be what the poll suggested as well. And that presents additional health and safety considerations for employers. If I could have the next slide, please. I feel like Chris Whitty saying that. So employers have a general duty to ensure the health, safety and well-being of their employees whilst they're at work, and that duty goes as far as is reasonably practicable, and it's a wide-ranging duty. So as you can see on the slide there, it extends to physical and mental well-being of employees, and that applies whether they're in the home or in the office. So employers also have a responsibility to take care of their own health and safety, and that also extends to the health and safety of others where they could potentially harm them. And part of that responsibility is cooperating with their employer and also their colleagues to help make sure that everyone is meeting those legal duties. And that could look like things like talking to their employer about specific queries or concerns and making sure that those are raised adequately. I think most employers now will be familiar with their responsibilities in the workplace and pretty used to dealing with those. Historically, we've always been in the office. And to a certain extent, employers will have become used to looking after and managing employees whilst they're working from home as well. But I think it's useful to highlight when we're talking about this, what the reality of hybrid working means for those responsibilities. If I could have the next slide, please. So all employers should be carrying out suitable and sufficient risk assessments of their employees' working environment. And I think that's also something that people are fairly aware that they need to do. And those should be identifying practical steps to mitigate any risks. And those assessments should also be regularly reviewed and updated because, you know, risks can change and those need to be managed as they do. It's also quite important that employers aren't making assumptions about staff wellbeing. And for that reason, staff should be consulted about what's going on. And employers actually have a duty to consult, especially on health and safety matters. And that includes what should be covered on any policies, particularly where change is going to take place. So employers need to be making sure that the procedures in place are there for staff to report any health and safety issues, as I mentioned earlier. And that could be in the form of a whistleblowing policy or a specific health and safety reporting mechanism. And employers should also be encouraging employees to use those mechanisms. And the most important thing is when those are reported, that they need to be being followed up, investigated and addressed so that there's actually a point to those being reported. If I could have the next slide, please. So clearly, just practically speaking, obviously risk assessments are much easier to do in the workplace. At home, it's not as easy to carry out a full risk assessment. So employees should be given information about working safely at home and asked to carry out a self-assessment. I think probably most of us needed some form of equipment to work from home at the start of the pandemic. I think most employers provided budgets for things like desks or big screens, but it's important to remember that those are ongoing obligations too. Obviously, as Danny mentioned, it's Mental Health Awareness Week, and going back to the employer's responsibility for mental as well as physical well-being, that should be considered with any risk assessment you're doing. The Health and Safety Executive recently published statistics on stress, anxiety and depression and concluded that those three issues counted for about 50% of work-related ill health. So that's a very significant proportion that we're talking about. And there are also other risk factors that you should be thinking about, such as domestic violence and abuse, and all the other issues that come with working from home, such as childcare and things like that, which could potentially be affecting the employees. So there's obvious benefits to being able to work from home, and we've all been able to enjoy those. But as Danny was highlighting, there are quite a lot of disadvantages too, as well as having to tell someone they're on mute at least once a day. There's things like finding it hard to switch off from work without the commute, and also working longer hours, as Danny was talking about. So with those in mind, employers should be thinking about reasonable steps that they can take to mitigate those. And those sort of things would be looking at clear policies on rest breaks and encouraging employees to take those, allowing employees flexibility on when they do take them. If they'd rather do a food shop at 3 p.m. rather than 1 p.m, making it clear that's allowed, subject to business needs. That was actually something Collier Bristow did during one of the lockdowns, and the clarity was really appreciated. I've also seen, and you probably have too, a lot of companies starting to use a footer on their emails along the lines of don't feel the need to respond to this email outside of your normal working hours. So I think that's going to be something that's more prevalent. You may have also seen in the news in the last couple of weeks that Prince Harry has been calling for firms to give employees time to focus on themselves. And that did actually get quite a lot of criticism. But the FT recently reported that the Japanese tech company Fujitsu started letting their employees block out an hour of their time each week for a non-work activity. So that also might be something that we start to see more of. So when you're thinking about this, you should be thinking about permanent ways to promote mental well-being. So not just the Mental Health Awareness Week. And that could be through appropriate policies, making sure that managers have mental health training, for example, and also employee assistance programs, which I'm sure many employers have, are a good way to help with those struggling. Just on the bottom there of the slide, another thing to note is that risk assessments should be looking at a wide variety of different groups of staff. For example, people who are pregnant, they're undoubtedly going to face completely different risks to some of the other employees. If I could have the next slide, please. So whilst we're looking at what happens if employers don't do all of this, well, as well as the normal commercial issues like discontent, poor staff retention, potential issues with recruitment, there are also going to be claims, a potential for claims against the company, and the types of claims are listed there on the slide. I don't propose to go through all of them in any detail, but just touching on pure employment claims that might arise, that could look like an employee claiming constructive unfair dismissal. So that would be a situation where effectively the employee is claiming that the employer's conduct was so poor that they've effectively breached the implied duty of trust and confidence, and that's a duty that's implied into every contract between the employer and employee. That effectively looks like a situation where the employees resigned because they feel that the employer's behaviour was so poor that they have no choice but to leave. And that potential for unfair dismissal could potentially be automatically unfair where an employee makes protected disclosure. So that's effectively blowing the whistle through the procedures that I was talking about earlier. And a complaint that the health and safety of any individual has been or has potentially been endangered counts as a protected disclosure for the purposes of that. And the consequences of that might be more severe than you think. So it potentially increases the amount an employee could claim. There's usually a cap if it's just a normal unfair dismissal claim. And it also broadens the number of employees that could bring a claim because they'd no longer need to have the 2-year service to be eligible to bring it. As you can see on the slide there, there's also the potential risk of a discrimination claim where we're dealing with mental health issues and things like that. There could potentially be classed as a disability under the equality legislation, and pregnancy is also a protected characteristic to think about too. So those are some major considerations for employers generally, but obviously there's still the ongoing issues now that we're living with COVID. So if I could have the next slide, please. So previously, employers were required to consider COVID specifically in their risk assessments, but that requirement ended on the 1st of April for most companies. It's still around for some, but that tends to be people who are dealing on a daily basis with the virus itself. So those who are at a higher risk of severe illness, if they catch COVID, might be quite anxious about the risk that they're going to catch it, and employers need to be sensitive to that when they're looking at risk and how they handle it. At this point too, you know, we're all sort of in a changing work environment, not really knowing what the future of work's going to look like, and returning to the workplace whilst COVID levels remain so high can be a concern for some, and also that's something that employers need to think about when they're considering their duty of care. So clearly the circumstances are going to vary considerably from person to person, and there won't be a one-size-fits-all at all. So there's going to be some dragging of feet when you're trying to get people back into the office, and that's a situation to handle carefully. You should be prepared to chat things through with employees to find a solution, and you might face situations where some people just point blank refuse to come back, regardless of the reason. And you should take legal advice in those situations because the issues at play can actually be very complex. And the reason why this is also important is because employers could potentially still bring claims relating to COVID risks. Historically, there have been some tribunal decisions on this, but we don't necessarily have clarity on when those claims will be successful. And I'm sure none of you want to be a test case for that. Next slide, please. So the government has released, in line with the living with COVID approach now, there's new workplace guidance identifying how employers can reduce the risk of respiratory infections. And that seems to be the approach they're taking. It's sort of moved away from COVID-specific things to just general respiratory infections. And the sort of things they suggest are listed there. So ventilation, ensuring the office gets cleaned regularly, and encouraging vaccination. Obviously, free testing ended last month, so probably unless you've stockpiled, you probably don't have any tests left. But employers could offer free lateral flow tests. That's not considered in the guidance, but testing could still have a bit of a part to play in some industries, or if you're really struggling with particularly vulnerable individuals. And that could all be dependent on the workplace, whether this is appropriate for you. So it'll depend on your particular office, your particular staff, and also the risk assessment that you've carried out. So either way, you should be able to justify why you're doing it and why it's appropriate, and what you're actually asking staff to do. And that should all be set out ideally in a clear policy. It could help some hesitant staff get confidence to come back, but you would need to think about what happens if someone tests positive and can't work from home. In those situations, you probably have to pay them if you didn't let them into the office. And you need to think about other things like data protection if you want to collect the test results, and also thinking about what happens if employees don't cooperate. So there again be the risk of unfair dismissal if you decided that you're going to dismiss employees if they didn't do a test. And sort of as I said earlier, the government's moved away from placing lots of responsibility on the employer for this. So it's moved to more towards individual responsibility. And there's specific guidance for individuals on how to live safely with COVID. And that's not addressed in the workplace guidance. So things like good hand hygiene, wearing a mask in some circumstances, all the sort of things that we've grown accustomed to, social distancing, things like that. If I could have the next slide, please. So obviously we're all living with COVID, but it's still got the potential to make people ill, whether that's mildly or not. And so talking about sick pay, special rules relating to COVID for statutory sick pay have now ended. So SSP is only available if the employee is unable to work and only from day 4 of incapacity. And that it doesn't matter if they're asymptomatic, there's no SSP available. Likewise, if they decide to isolate or anything like that. The workplace guidance suggests that employers should consider how they can help employees follow the guidance that's available. And that seems to mean that staff with symptoms should stay away from the workplace. But unhelpfully, the guidance doesn't actually identify any examples of how employers can go about doing that. But one obvious option is to pay sick pay to employees if they can't work from home. So that's obviously short-term mild illness, but we're all aware of long COVID and the potential for causing long-term sick leave. And the Office of National Statistics reported in March this year that there are around 1.7 million people with long COVID, so it's not an insignificant number. And given the long nature of it, combined with its ability to cause both physical and mental impairment, it means it could probably be considered a disability under the discrimination legislation. So quite controversially recently, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission tweeted that it did not think long COVID is a disability, which received huge backlash. But that does sort of highlight that it's slightly unclear situation. So probably in those circumstances, it's best to take a cautious approach if you're not sure. And then in terms of pay, SSP is only available for 28 weeks. So some companies do have sick pay policies with entitlement to longer term pay, but it's probably a good time in any event to think about those policies and potentially looking at those policies and employment contracts where there might be things incorporated in there to check that they're all up to date and that they're clear, and as with all policies, that they're communicated to staff. So obviously health and safety is a massive topic to cover in 15 minutes, but that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully it set out some useful pointers for you, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions you may have if you put them in the Q&A box. And now I'm going to hand over to Sinead, who's up next talking about employee monitoring and surveillance.
Thank you, Emma. So I'm going to be taking a look at employee monitoring, particularly in the context of remote working. And as both Danny and Emma have now mentioned, there has, of course, been a huge shift in working practices over the past few years. And going forward, hybrid models of working are becoming the norm for many businesses, with more flexibility around home working, whether that be on a full-time or a part-time basis. For some businesses, and perhaps more so pre-COVID, the idea of allowing staff to work from home might have conjured up this image of employees sat in their pyjamas watching Netflix and just occasionally sending the odd email. And clearly, if anyone saw Alan Sugar's tweet on Monday, some employers might still be thinking along those lines. And I think it's largely as a result of those concerns about productivity levels that reports have emerged over the past few years of employers sometimes taking quite extreme action to monitor their employees. For example, you can hear of things like taking screenshots via webcams or monitoring an employee's mouse movements or their keystrokes via tracking software. Now, those are obviously quite extreme examples of what employee monitoring can entail. And before I delve into the legal position, I want to clarify what employee monitoring can actually encompass. So taken at a very basic level, monitoring in the employment context is where employers use or process information about their employees to look at what work is being done, where the work's being done, or how it's being done. And they might be doing that quite openly, but in some cases, it's often done more covertly. So it can include things like checking somebody's emails or perhaps messages on Teams, monitoring internet usage, recording telephone calls, having remote screen access or mirroring a screen, checking employees' log-on times, or even reviewing GPS information from their work mobile phones. And then on the list there, you'll see on the slide, there's the more extreme cases, like installing tracking software that I mentioned earlier. And I think it's also important to take a quick look at why employers might be monitoring their employees, because it's not necessarily always about tracking productivity or in response to suspected malingering, but it can sometimes be carried out with quite good intentions. So, for example, some employers might be checking working hours purely for well-being purposes, just to make sure their employees aren't overworked. Or it could be to comply with regulatory requirements, particularly in the financial services sector, for example. So the main question, is employee monitoring legal? And the short answer is yes, it can be, but you won't be surprised to hear that it's not as straightforward as that. And there are, of course, caveats and restrictions that limit the extent to which it's permissible. Before I move into the employment law aspects, I think it's really important to first take a look at the data protection implications, because ultimately, any information that's captured from employee monitoring is going to amount to personal data. And in some cases, that might even stray into more sensitive personal information. If, for example, you capture information about an employee's health, or any of the monitoring might capture information about somebody's religious or political beliefs. So under the GDPR and Data Protection Act 2018, employees have got a right to be fully informed about the lawful basis upon which their employer is processing their personal data. And it used to be the case that employers would try to rely on consent from employees as the lawful basis for monitoring. But in an employment context, it's questionable whether an employee can be said to freely give their consent, because obviously there's an imbalance of power between the parties. And of course, consent can also be quite problematic because it can be withheld from the outset or withdrawn at any point. So most employers nowadays will try to seek and to rely on having what's called a legitimate interest as being the lawful basis for processing personal data in that way. And that's usually seen as the most flexible basis. So for the purpose of employee monitoring, a legitimate interest might be something like to improve employee productivity, or to monitor employee well-being, or even to ensure compliance with company policies. However, the employer's potential legitimate interest has to be balanced against the employee's rights and their reasonable expectations of privacy. So employers have to assess the proportionality of a potential legitimate interest, and it's advisable that they conduct what's called a legitimate interest assessment so that they can track and keep a record of that balancing exercise. Now, one of the core principles underpinning data legislation is transparency, and all employers should have an employee privacy notice or privacy policy, which sets out the types of personal data that might be collected, how that data is collected, and how it might be used. And if any type of employee monitoring is carried out, that needs to be clearly covered in a privacy notice with reference to the appropriate lawful basis. And employers also need to consider whether they have to carry out what's called a data protection impact assessment. And that's essentially a more detailed risk assessment to identify potential privacy issues where they could pose a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the employees. Now, it's good practice to do that in all cases, but it's going to be particularly relevant if any employers are considering more intrusive types of employee monitoring, like the screenshot images captured from webcams that I mentioned earlier. And just before we move on from data protection, I just want to sort of stress that the importance of data protection can often be overlooked, and businesses sometimes just see it as a bit of a burden to have to comply with. But I think it's fair to say that there's definitely an increased awareness amongst employees of their data protection rights, and that's certainly something my colleagues and I have witnessed recently. And so if employers are considering monitoring their employees, it's really crucial now more than ever to have the right policies in place. Okay, so next I'm going to take a look at some issues from an employment or HR perspective. And firstly is the risk of discrimination under the Equality Act. And that's something that Danny's also touched upon. So some of you might have seen in the news recently that in the US, Apple announced that they were going to do a new phased return to work. And that was met with some quite fierce criticism from the employees, who said that it would end up creating a younger, whiter, more male-dominated, more neuronormative and more able-bodied workforce. And I think it's really important for businesses to think about exactly who is working from home and who might continue to be office-based before imposing any monitoring practices, as it's quite possible that there might be more females working from home, or there might be more employees of a certain age bracket working from home. So any monitoring policy that applies only to remote workers could potentially lead to discrimination claims. In some cases, it might be possible to justify monitoring to try and avoid discrimination claims, but that's absolutely something that needs to be considered from the outset before imposing any monitoring, rather than retrospectively. Another key issue to consider is how employees are likely to feel about being monitored. And in many cases, and again, this is something Danny touched upon, it's fair to say that employees might work more productively at home and in fact might be working longer hours. So if an employer announces a new monitoring policy, those employees might think that it's almost like a big brother kind of imposition on them. And fundamentally, it's likely to make them feel as though they're not trusted, or they might feel undervalued, or even sometimes that they're being micromanaged. And again, that's likely to differ from employees who are based in the office if there's a discrepancy between who the monitoring applies to. And that can pose particular problems, including things like it might make it more difficult to recruit and retain good employees, particularly if they want more flexibility to work from home without feeling like their actions are being scrutinised. And it can also affect employee morale and motivation, and that in turn can actually have the reverse effect on their productivity levels potentially. And it's also likely to have an impact on well-being, and obviously Emma's discussed that in more detail, but inevitably, if you know that you're being monitored, that adds another layer of pressure onto the workforce. And of course, employees are likely to be even more upset if they haven't actually been told that they're being monitored at all, and it only comes to their attention at a later date. Now, I've got on the slide there, and I'm not sure how visible it might be, but I think the slides are getting circulated. It's a table from a recent YouGov survey, which was published last year, looking into how employees feel about being monitored. And the main takeaway from that is that employees are actually more willing to accept monitoring where there's a more human approach. So if there's something like a regular check-in or direct evaluation of their work by a manager, rather than things like software trackers. And finally, perhaps the biggest risk that an employer might face is that an employee could claim that as a result of some form of monitoring, there's been a breach of trust and confidence, which, as Emma explained, is an implied term in every contract of employment. And that can be particularly problematic, as essentially the employee is saying that the employer has breached the employment contract by their conduct, and as a result, the employee could resign immediately and they could claim that they've been constructively dismissed. And one of the main issues there is that the employee might then try to argue that as a result of the breach of contract, the other contractual terms no longer apply, such as some of the post-termination restrictions. And so it's really important for employers to try and limit that risk to protect the business. Okay, so we've looked at some of the key issues that employers might face with employee monitoring. And whilst we don't have time today to delve into every single issue that might arise, there are some further considerations that any employer thinking about monitoring should be aware of. Firstly, as you'll see on the slide there, is Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, which is the right to respect for private and family life. That's something that should always be considered before any type of monitoring is put into place, but it's particularly relevant where there's any type of monitoring which might impact an area where an employee would have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So, for example, if there's monitoring via a webcam which looks into the employee's home, or if there's covert monitoring of phone calls or emails, especially where there could also be personal calls or emails on those same accounts. The second point I've noted, and this actually overlaps somewhat with the previous point, is that some employees use their own personal equipment for work purposes when they're working remotely. So that might be a personal laptop or a mobile phone, and hopefully not, but I have actually seen some examples of employees using their personal email accounts for work purposes too. So any employer that's looking to impose monitoring in such cases needs to be particularly aware of the employee's legal rights and make sure that their IT and other relevant policies adequately deal with the use of personal equipment. And the final thing I will mention, or rather reiterate from some of my previous points, is that it's absolutely crucial to review policies and contracts of employment to make sure they're kept up to date and that they're amended if and when monitoring practices change. So as a closing note, I just want to stress really that the question of what amounts to lawful and appropriate monitoring is incredibly nuanced, and no employer should implement employee monitoring without considering, firstly, the rationale for the monitoring, and secondly, the effect it's going to have on the workforce. And in particular, employers should be considering whether they're acting in a proportionate and justified manner. And if they get to a stage of deciding what type of monitoring might be most appropriate, then it's always worth thinking about whether there might be some less intrusive options which could achieve the same objective. So, for example, if you have concerns about productivity, you might be able to implement closer supervision as a first step. Or if you've got concerns about the hours that employees might be working, then you could arrange some open and informal wellbeing chats. So that concludes the employee monitoring section for today, and I'll hand back over to Tanya.
Thanks, Sinead, and also to Emma and Danny for those very insightful presentations and thoughts. I mean, clearly there's an absolutely huge amount to keep in mind here. And as everyone has said, we're only really able to, scratch the surface of some of these issues. So if you've got further questions, and I can see some have already popped up on our screens, then we'll get back to you if we're not able to deal with them in this session, which I think given the time frame, probably we won't be able to cover them all, but perhaps one or two. So maybe just following on from Sinead, she's, we're still on the sort of just finished the topic that she's talked about. Somebody's asked, Sinead, is it necessary to have an employee monitoring clause in a contract of employment if the business intends carrying out any monitoring? Quite an important question, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because pre-GDPR, employee monitoring clauses were actually quite common, but that was because the employers were trying to use them to seek to rely on having the employee's consent when the employee signs the contract. And as I mentioned earlier, under the GDPR, it's no longer safe to try and rely on consent in that way. So employers really need to explain to the employee what the lawful basis is for monitoring, and that would usually be set out in a privacy policy. And the business would also probably have an IT or electronic communications policy that details the type of monitoring that might be carried out. So strictly, I would say no, it's not necessary to have a monitoring clause in a contract of employment. But that said, it might be useful to include to show that you're making the employee aware of the business's ability to monitor them. And you can also use it to signpost the relevant policies which explain what monitoring is carried out in more detail.
Yeah, it certainly can't do any harm, can it? I think it's all about being transparent. And if you end up in a tribunal, it would be a helpful thing to be able to show the tribunal judge that you'd actually done everything you could to bring it to the employee's attention. So yeah, I tend to agree with that. Emma had a question for you. What do you do if an employee doesn't want to return to the workplace because they say they're vulnerable?
That's a good question, and probably something I imagine quite a lot of businesses are having to deal with at the moment. So the government hasn't been particularly clear about this. There is some specific guidance covering those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, but they've actually summarised that those who are vaccinated and vulnerable are now at no greater risk than the rest of the population and should be following the normal advice. But the reality is quite different if someone's anxious about returning because of that particular vulnerability. I think the only thing that they distinguish is if someone is immunosuppressed, and then they say that in those situations it's probably a good idea for them to speak to their employer and consider what's right for them, and potentially that could be working from home. So I think it's probably good practice to think about prioritising these particularly vulnerable people and maybe facilitating them working from home, either full-time or partially, and that could even be temporary, just till we see how COVID spans out. But I think, as I said during the webinar, it's probably important to take advice from employers during situations like that, just because of how tricky and complex those things can be. And as I highlighted before, there's potential for discrimination that could easily arise there if you're applying a blanket policy to your entire workforce and not taking into account someone that does have a disability, for example. So yeah, I think the first and foremost, speak to the employee and try and work out something, but at the same time, simultaneously get a bit of legal advice to help you.
Okay, sounds good. I think we've got time just to squeeze in one more. Danny, someone's asked, what can an employer do if an employee complains of a lack of visibility when working from home, other than perhaps having them to come into the office? But yeah, I don't want to be too cynical. What else might you suggest?
Thanks, Tanya. Just quickly, because I realise the time. It's obviously a very complex question, and I think an employer needs to first of all figure out whether this is a grievance. If it's an informal complaint to a line manager or a formal grievance, I think they need to listen to the employee, listen to where they're saying they're not being seen or heard. The solution might be, like you say, come into the office, but dealing with that in a serious way, making the employee feel seen and heard in that discussion as well will go a long way. And like I said, obviously more complex, but which we haven't got time for, but if it's a grievance, treat it as a grievance, follow your policies and procedures, be alert for any thing that might amount to a complaint of discrimination. This complaint might amount to a protected act, and you want to make sure that you deal with it appropriately. Potentially there could be a protected disclosure in there. So again, deal with it under any whistleblowing policies that you have. But I think the essential, the basic response is deal with it and deal with it properly and make that person feel seen and heard in that process.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. Thanks for being brief in your response. So our hour is up. If we haven't answered your questions, we're sorry, we'll get back to you afterwards. And if you've got any more questions for us, feel free to get in touch. All our contact details are there. So we look forward to hearing from you. Also, please keep an eye on our regular updates. We post a lot of stuff on our website, both employment and all other legal matters from Collier Bristow. So why not sign up to some of those if you're interested. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, of course, individually or through Collier Bristow. And I think that's probably all we have time for today. So we'd all like to wish you a great day, whether you're working from home, in an office, or perhaps in a more tropical location disguised by a screen filter. Whichever it is, don't worry, we won't tell. Enjoy the sunshine. Have a good day. Bye for now.